The storm gathers over the English countryside, its wind clawing at the broken arches of an ancient abbey. Lightning slices through the sky, illuminating for a brief, dreadful instant the hollowed ruins of Medmenham. And there, beneath the crumbling stones, far from the eyes of the devout and the poor, the rulers of Britain raise their goblets high, not to God, but to the devil himself. Wine, black as blood in the candlelight, spills over jeweled hands as they chant in mock Latin words, twisted from the mass words once sacred and now profaned. A woman lies upon a marble slab where an altar once stood. Her body is bare, save for a crown of roses, her arms outstretched in a parody of crucifixion. Around her, masked men in monks' robes laugh, their voices echoing like demons across the vaulted chamber. One presses a silver chalice to her lips. Another scatters incense that smokes not in prayer, but in desecration. In the shadows, figures writhe, tangled in lust, their movements as chaotic as the storm raging beyond the abbey walls. The thunder crashes, and for a moment, the earth itself seems to join the blasphemy. These are not nameless revelers. They are parliamentarians, lordsmen, whose decisions shape the empire stretching across oceans. By day, they speak of virtue, of morality, of England's Protestant faith. But by night, they surrender themselves to something else entirely, something darker, something that no sermon or law can restrain. And so the question burns hotter than the torches on those ruined stones. What truly happened within the walls of the Hellfire Club? Were these scenes mere parody, an elaborate jest of drunk aristocrats mocking the church? Or were they something far more sinister, orgies entwined with sacrilege, politics mingled with satanic vows, the most powerful men in Britain testing not just their freedom, but their damnation? It is here in this chamber of shadows and laughter that the veil lifts. And once you have looked inside, you cannot turn away. The 18th century was an age that liked to boast of its brilliance. Britain stood at the pinnacle of its power, the sun gilding the sails of ships that carried its reach across the globe. London, with its theatres, coffee houses and palaces, glittered as the beating heart of empire. But glitter is a curious thing. It blinds as much as it dazzles. Behind the polished marble and powdered wigs lay a society divided cruelly, so luxury for the few, hunger for the many. The aristocracy lived as if they were gods, walking among mortals. Imagine banquet halls awash in candlelight, their ceilings painted with allegories of Olympus. Platters of roasted meats, mountains of sugared fruit fountains, of burgundy and port, all served beneath crystal chandeliers that shimmered like constellations. Women in silk gowns the colour of sunrise, men in brocade waistcoats embroidered with gold thread, gossiping about affairs at court, while servants moved silently in visible shadows at their feet. For these men and women of privilege, every night was a play, every day an exhibition of status and superiority. And yet the same mouths that dripped with honeyed wine also praised morality. The church pews were filled on Sundays. Parliament thundered with speeches about virtue and order, piety, chastity, temperance. These were the virtues imposed on the commoners. The poor crowded in rotting tenements, children sold into labour, women punished for sins that gentlemen committed freely. The hypocrisy was not hidden. It was a pillar upon which power itself rested. Into this stage stepped Francis Dashwood, heir to wealth and influence, a man of wit and appetite. Born to privilege, he was educated at Eton, polished in the salons of Europe, and carried himself with the easy grace of one who had never known want. He was as comfortable addressing Parliament as he was raising a toast in a tavern. But beneath his charm was restlessness. Dashwood found the rituals of polite society hollow, the sermons of priests laughable, the pomp of kings tiresome. He was a man intoxicated by contradiction, outwardly respectable, inwardly drawn to rebellion. Travel opened his eyes further. In Italy, he gazed at ruins where once emperors had feasted and fallen. In France, he mingled with libertines who whispered of pleasures unbound by law or God. In Venice, he slipped into masked carnivals where identity dissolved in the fever of the night. These experiences stayed with him fermenting, feeding a thought that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Why obey a God who never answers? Why not mock him instead? Yet, in the salons of London, none could have guessed the shadows gathering behind Dashwood's smile. To his peers, he was merely eccentric, a collector of art, a lover of fine wine, a parliamentarian with sharp wit. But behind the velvet drapes and mirrored halls of aristocratic life, the seeds of something darker had already been sown. The gilded cage sparkled brilliantly, but the cracks had begun to spread. It always begins with whispers, not proclamations, not thunderclaps, just murmurs in candlelit rooms, hints, dropped over wine questions that make respectable men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. For Francis Dashwood, those whispers began with philosophy, with words penned by men who dared to challenge God himself. The Enlightenment promised reason and progress, yet it also carved cracks in the fortress of faith. What if heaven is a fiction? What if sin is only a leash meant to bind us? Dashwood devoured such ideas like forbidden fruit. But he was not content to simply debate them in drawing rooms or scribble them in the margins of a book. He was a man of appetite, of flesh and impulse. And once an idea took root in him, it demanded to be lived. During his travels on the continent, he had walked through ruined temples, their stones carved with the faces of forgotten gods. In Italy, he had stood before the frescoes of pagan revels, bodies entwined in ecstasy, once condemned as heathen, now revered as art. In Paris, he had slipped into salons where libertines mocked priests with bawdy songs, where a toast to Venus was as common as a prayer to Christ. In Venice, he had seen masked figures vanish into candlelit chambers where identity dissolved into lust and mystery. Each encounter etched itself into his imagination, a gallery of indulgence and defiance. Back in England, amid the rigid rituals of Parliament and the pious scolding of bishops, these memories burned like coals under ash. Dashwood gathered around him a circle of men who shared his hunger. They were not the faceless poor, but men of wealth, of office lords, poets, merchants, even ministers. By day, they served king and country. By night, they dreamed of breaking chains too ancient and too sacred to be named aloud. At first, the gatherings seemed harmless. A private dinner in the country where the wine never ceased to flow, where women actresses, courtesans and adventurers were invited to provide entertainment of every kind. They called it pleasure. They called it freedom. They laughed at priests and recited verse that mocked scripture. But slowly the laughter sharpened. Pleasure was no longer enough. It had to be wrapped in defiance. If society worshipped God, they would mock him. If Parliament cloaked itself in virtue, they would strip it bare. They began to play with symbols, dressing as monks, raising goblets like chalices, twisting sacred rites into jests that tasted of blasphemy. It was parody, they told themselves, satire in its most intoxicating form. But there was a difference between mocking shadows and summoning them. Whispers began to spread beyond their circle. Servants talked, courtesans bragged, pamphleteers hinted. What was this strange brotherhood of monks who laughed at God behind closed doors? And what would happen if their games were revealed? The seeds had been planted. And once planted seeds must grow. It was in the ruins of Medmenham Abbey, on the banks of the Thames, that Francis Dashwood found the perfect stage for his vision. The abbey had been built by Cistercian monks centuries earlier, a place of silence and devotion. Now its stones were cracked, its arches broken ivy curling over its walls like veins of time itself. Where once monks had knelt in prayer, bats circled and shadows pooled. To most, it was a ruin. To Dashwood, it was an opportunity, a theatre for sacrilege. He leased the abbey in secret, pouring wealth into its transformation. The crumbling walls were restored not with holy intent, but with profane imagination. Classical statues of Venus and Bacchus stood where crucifixes once hung. The vaulted chambers were painted with frescoes of myth and desire, nymphs entwined with satyrs' cherubs wielding goblets instead of harps. Behind hidden doors, tunnels wound into chambers where light seldom touched. Every stone seemed to conspire in the creation of a private world, a sanctuary not of God, but of indulgence. Here, the Brotherhood gathered cloaked in robes to mimic monks. They called themselves the Knights of St. Francis, though the world would come to know them by another name, the Hellfire Club. Among them were names whispered with awe and fear. John Montague, the rakish Earl of Sandwich; John Wilkes, the radical politician; even Prince of Wales, some claimed, though proof is elusive. Their ranks shifted, but the principle was constant. Men of influence, bound not by morality, but by secrecy and appetite. The rituals they enacted were a parody of faith. A mock mass where chalices brimmed with wine, women dressed as nuns, served at altars of flesh, and sacred prayers were twisted into hymns of lust. They revelled in inversion where society said thou shalt not, they shouted we shall. Each transgression was not just pleasure, but power, a demonstration that the rules binding ordinary men stopped at the abbey's gates. Yet secrecy is a fragile veil. Servants whispered of women crowned in roses of laughter echoing through the night of the devil's name spoken in mock prayer. Courtesans carried tales into the taverns of London. Pamphleteers hungry for scandal spread rumours of sacrifices of pacts signed in blood of Satan himself, enthroned in the abbey's crypt. Truth blurred with invention until it no longer mattered. To the public, the Hellfire Club was no longer a parody. It was blasphemy incarnate. And with every whisper, the trap tightened. Dashwood and his companions had built a sanctuary to defy society, but in doing so, they had made themselves its most tempting prey. Enemies in Parliament, rivals in court, the ever-watchful clergy, each waited for the moment when secrecy would falter. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke. At first, it was laughter. Wine-spilled verses mocked the priests, women draped in veils of parody knelt at altars of flesh. It all seemed a jest, a grand lampoon of piety. But laughter has a way of curdling when it feeds on mockery too long. What began as parody began to taste like ritual. And in the darkened halls of Medmenham Abbey, the line between jest and devotion blurred until even the revellers could not tell the difference. The feasts grew wilder, more elaborate. Tables sagged beneath roasted swans' pyramids of sugared fruit, oceans of claret and champagne. Candles dripped wax like blood upon the stone floors as men in robes bellowed hymns twisted into obscenities. Courtesans dressed in habits to mock nuns sang psalms that dissolved into shrieks of ecstasy. The air was thick with incense musk and sweat, a fog that clung to skin and suffocated reason. Every sense was assaulted, the taste of wine, the scent of flesh, the clash of laughter and chant. But indulgence, like any appetite, demands escalation. Mere pleasure was no longer enough. They sought transgression. The thrill came not from the kiss or the goblet, but from the knowledge that each act spat in the face of morality. They dined beneath painted ceilings where satyrs ravished nymphs, as if mocking the saints whose frescoes once adorned those walls. They staged mock baptisms in wine, mock confessions, whispered not to God, but to courtesans, mock resurrections that ended in orgies sprawling across the cold stone. The more they mocked, the more they believed they were untouchable. Dashwood himself began to drift toward extremes. His friends saw it in the glint of his eyes as he raised the chalice higher, as if testing whether the devil might answer his parody with presence. Did he believe in Satan? Perhaps not. but he believed in the thrill of daring the abyss to stare back. And sometimes, in the flickering lamplight, it seemed as if the shadows did move, as if the laughter of men had drawn something older into the chamber. Outside the abbey, the rumours thickened like storm clouds. Servants spoke of black masses of goats, led into chambers of infants heard crying in the night. Pamphleteers embroidered the tales with lurid detail, spinning the revels into horrors fit for nightmares. Truth and invention became inseparable. Political enemies of Dashwood seized upon the whispers, brandishing them as evidence of corruption festering at the very heart of Britain's ruling class. And so the descent was not only moral, but political. Each night of revelry carved another crack in the armour of secrecy. Each rumour, true or false, widened the gap between the abbey's walls and the world outside. The laughter that once rang as freedom now echoed like doom. For pleasure may intoxicate, but power always draws blood. And soon, the Hellfire Club would discover that the darkness they courted had teeth. The storm finally broke not in thunder, but in ink. Pamphlets circulated through London like poison in the bloodstream, each one dripping with scandal. They told of midnight rites in ruined abbeys of noblemen dressed as monks drinking toasts to Satan of women sprawled upon altars in obscene parodies of the Virgin. Truth was irrelevant. Suggestion alone was enough to ignite outrage. And in 18th century Britain, outrage was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Francis Dashwood and his circle suddenly found themselves thrust into the public spotlight, but not as libertines. They were painted as heretics, traitors, even devil worshippers. Parliamentarians who once toasted with them in secrecy now pounded their fists in righteous fury, condemning the very excesses they themselves had indulged in. The clergy thundered from pulpits that England's soul was imperiled, that the devil himself sat smiling at the heart of the nation's elite. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Men who had once slipped into Medmenham by torchlight now spoke as if they had never heard of it. Old allies turned silent, fearful of their reputations. And yet no one could ever prove the darkest rumours. There were no trials for witchcraft, no executions for blasphemy, only the slow strangulation of scandal wielded with surgical precision. Some, however, were less fortunate. John Wilkes, the radical pamphleteer and Hellfire member, became the perfect target. A notorious libertine and a thorn in the side of authority, he published a lewd parody of The Essay on Woman, complete with obscene mock prayers. It was more than his enemies needed. They branded him a corrupter of morals, a traitor to decency. His trial was not about justice, it was a spectacle. The court draped itself in virtue, denouncing him with theatrical indignation, while ignoring the vices of those seated in judgment. The message was clear: the Hellfire Club was not condemned for sin, but for being exposed. Dashwood, cushioned by his title and political connections, endured, with his reputation bruised, but his position intact. Wilkes, less protected, was dragged through the mire of public humiliation. Justice, if it could be called, that served as a mask punishment not for guilt, but for inconvenience. Meanwhile, the rumours themselves became more powerful than any verdict. Tales of goat sacrifices of black candles and pacts written in blood filled the imagination of a society eager for scandal. Was any of it true? No one could say for certain. But certainty was never the point. The power lay in the suggestion. Behind closed doors, the Hellfire men understood the game. They had been pawns all along chess pieces in a cruel battle of politics and morality. The Abbey, once a sanctuary of indulgence, had become an arsenal for their enemies. Their private rebellion had been transformed into public ammunition. And so the laughter that once rang through Medmenham faded into silence, replaced by the grinding wheels of power and the cold mask of justice that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with control. The Abbey was silent now. Where once torches flared and goblets clattered, only the wind moved through the ivy-choked arches. Francis Dashwood, older now, heavier in body, but thinner in spirit, walked its empty corridors at dawn. His steps echoed against the stone, not with the laughter of companions, but with the memory of voices long silenced. Every chamber seemed to whisper fragments of songs, sighs mock prayers that once reverberated off the walls. But the echoes belonged to ghosts, and the revels had dissolved into myth. In his youth, Dashwood had sought to burn brightly against the dullness of society, but age has a way of dimming fire. His hair thinned, his wit dulled, and the appetite that once seemed endless now brought only fatigue. The empire he had mocked in parody marched forward without him, fueled by wars abroad and scandals at home. And he, once a man of whispers and laughter, became remembered not as a statesman, but as a libertine. On one such morning, he paused in the Abbey's great hall. The altar slab still stood cracked and stained with candle wax. He ran his hand across it, as though tracing the memory of the woman crowned in roses who once lay there. He could not decide whether the memory brought shame, nostalgia, or defiance. Perhaps all three. Perhaps none. For in old age, even the most vivid nights blur like smoke. Friends were gone. Some had died, others had fled the shadow of scandal. John Wilkes, his old companion, had lived on as a symbol of liberty, his name spoken in the same breath as rebellion. Dashwood, by contrast, faded quietly, cushioned by wealth, but stripped of the laughter that once defined him. The Abbey itself had become a ruin within a ruin, its secrets absorbed into the soil, its sins remembered only in whispers passed from tavern to tavern. There is something cruel in old age. It strips away illusions, yet denies clarity. Did Dashwood believe he had accomplished something by mocking God, by parodying the rites of the church? Or had it all been a masquerade of boys playing at devils, only to be remembered as fools? As he stood in that hall, the sun spilling through the broken windows, he seemed less the master of rebellion and more its final relic. His last days were marked by stillness. He no longer sought scandal or laughter. He sought only comfort. And yet, beneath the mask of peace, one truth gnawed. He would not be remembered for his role in Parliament, nor for his estates, nor for his patronage of art. He would be remembered for the Hellfire Club, for orgies in ruined abbeys, for whispers of Satan, for sins real and imagined that clung like shadows to his name. As the dawn light struck the altar one final time, Dashwood turned away. It was not death that frightened him now. It was memory, which is more enduring and far less merciful. The chamber is lit by 100 flames, each candle trembling against the stone, as though even fire itself is afraid. The air is heavy, thick with incense and sweat, a haze that clings to skin and makes the walls seem to pulse like the ribs of some living beast. It is the Abbey's final convocation, and the Hellfire Club has prepared a spectacle meant to outshine every blasphemy that came before. The altar stands draped in scarlet cloth. Upon it, roses are scattered like drops of blood, their perfume mingling with the acrid bite of smoke. A woman lies stretched across its surface, her body shimmering in the lamplight, her wrists crowned with garlands. She is no prisoner. She is a participant performer, willing or not. It hardly matters. Around her, masked figures close in their robes, swaying as they chant Latin verses twisted into grotesque mimicry. Ave Saturnus, they whisper, as though daring the darkness itself to answer. Goblets clink, wine spills. A figure in a gilded mask raises the chalice as though presiding over mass, his voice booming against the walls. This is not the body of Christ, but the flesh of pleasure. Laughter explodes, obscene and triumphant. Men drop their masks, revealing flushed faces, eyes gleaming with intoxication, with hunger. Courtesans move among them, veils falling habits torn away their bodies, offered as living satire of the nuns whose prayers once filled the abbey. The ritual dissolves into chaos. The chants grow louder, blending with cries of lust and shrieks of ecstasy. Flesh writhes against stone bodies, tangle upon the floor, the very air vibrating with frenzy. Every moan, every gasp is amplified by the echo of the ruined walls, until it becomes not merely an orgy, but a storm, a torrent of sound that seems to rattle the heavens themselves. And yet beneath the fever, there is something chilling. The grotesque parody feels too complete, too rehearsed. Some kneel as though in genuine supplication, their faces lit not with mockery, but with something darker devotion. A knife flashes in the candlelight, not in sacrifice, but in gesture, as though to test how close parody can come to invocation. For a moment, the laughter falters, and the silence that follows is more terrifying than the noise. Did they believe? Did they even for a breath believe that they had summoned something beyond themselves? No one would ever say. What happened in that chamber would melt into rumour truth swallowed by imagination. But the spectacle left its mark. Even in memory, it feels less like revelry than execution. The execution of innocence, of restraint, of the very notion that power should be bound by morality. What began as satire had curdled into something unforgettable, something unforgivable. When the last candle guttered out, the abbey sank into shadow. The laughter was gone. What remained was the stench of smoke, the ache of excess, and the uneasy sense that something sacred had been killed that night, though no corpse lay upon the stone. When the laughter died, it left a silence so sharp it cut the air like glass. The abbey that had throbbed with wine and chant, with flesh and frenzy, now stood hollow, its stones damp with the sweat of bodies already gone. The candles sputtered out one by one, leaving only the faint hiss of wax cooling upon stone. Goblets lay overturned on the floor, their spilled contents drying like dark stains of blood. A single garland of roses, torn and crushed, lay upon the altar where moments before bodies had writhed. The storm had passed, but the echo of it clung to the walls, as though they themselves had been scarred. Outside, the Thames rolled on indifferent, carrying mist across its banks. No crowd gathered at the abbey's gates. No mob with torches stormed the ruin. There was no spectacle of punishment, no public reckoning. Instead, there was quiet, more unsettling than any outcry could have been. The members of the Hellfire Club, so bold in their parody, so shameless in their indulgence, slipped back into their carriages and rode into the dawn. By breakfast, some would sit in Parliament, debating taxes and laws, as if the night's desecration had never happened. This was their true mask respectability. Dashwood could host a dinner at his estate. Montague could argue naval policy. Wilkes could brandish his pen, and each man could pretend that the abbey was nothing more than a ruined stone curiosity by the river. The silence that followed their revels was not ignorance, it was collusion. Everyone knew or thought they knew, and yet nothing was spoken aloud where it could matter. But silence does not erase, it lingers haunting. Servants whispered in kitchens of what they had seen, courtesans recounted tales in hushed tones to eager listeners, and pamphleteers inked their rumours into scandal. For the public, the silence was filled with imagination tales of sacrifices of Satan enthroned of corruption at the heart of Britain. Truth and fiction twisted together until neither could be separated. Dashwood himself would walk the abbey in later years and feel it too. He would stand before the cracked altar and hear nothing but the wind, and yet in that nothing lay everything, the weight of memory, the dread of judgment, the cold knowledge that some sins leave stains no sermon can wash away. The eerie silence after the Hellfire Club's excesses was more damning than any verdict, for it spoke not of justice, but of avoidance. The men had returned to their lives, but the abbey remained a ruin, layered with ruins, a place where echoes never truly fade. And so silence itself became the final accomplice, ensuring that the deeds of Medmenham would never be confessed, never be absolved, only whispered in the shadows, century after century. History has a peculiar way of remembering. It forgets treaties and speeches, yet it clings to scandal. Francis Dashwood had served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, had held office, had navigated the politics of the empire. But when his name is spoken, it is not of ledgers or reforms. It is of orgies in ruined abbeys, of monks' robes and scarlet altars of laughter in the face of God. The Hellfire Club became his monument, and it was built not of stone, but of rumour and fear. Some historians dismiss the tales as exaggeration, pamphleteers spinning wild fantasies to slander rivals. They argue the revels were little more than drunken parties dressed up in parody. Yet the very persistence of the legend says otherwise. For if the Hellfire Club was only satire, why does its name still chill? Why after centuries do we still picture masked men raising goblets to Satan beneath candlelit arches? Perhaps because, even as myth, it speaks to something eternal in the human heart, the allure of forbidden power. The consequences were subtle, but sharp. John Wilkes, forced into exile, became a symbol of liberty, his persecution by morality feeding the fires of rebellion that would eventually cross the Atlantic. The public scandal around the Hellfire Club deepened distrust in the aristocracy, fueling the sense that those who ruled were corrupt beyond redemption. And beneath it all lingered a darker lesson that when men of power believe themselves untouchable, they will mock the very foundations of the world that sustains them. Medmenham Abbey still stands, its stones softened by moss, its arches open to the sky. Tourists wander its ruins, some knowing its story, others feeling only a vague unease at its silence. But if you close your eyes, you might still hear it, the echo of a goblet, clinking the murmur of a chant, the laughter that should never have been heard in a house of prayer. Echoes do not die. They coil, waiting to be remembered. And so the Hellfire Club endures not merely as scandal, not merely as satire, but as a mirror held up to human nature, reflecting what happens when piety becomes performance, when hypocrisy curdles into indulgence, when rebellion against corruption becomes corruption itself. Perhaps that is why we cannot let go of the story. It is not only about 18th century Britain, it is about us, about the eternal temptation of the forbidden, the seduction of power, and the ease with which men turn freedom into debauchery. So, ask yourself, was the Hellfire Club just a parody of faith and politics, a drunken carnival of mockery? Or was it proof that when left unchecked, men of influence will always build their own private hells and call it freedom?